this entire thing just about with his own money. He was paid back. He was reimbursed later, but only for about 2/3 of that. So tuck that away for later. Arnold is not going to be happy. He's going to feel like he's always having to spend money out of his own pocket, and Congress doesn't appreciate him enough to pay him back. But for now, no time to think about that. We've got an attack to lead, right? Arnold and his soldiers, this is the plan. And by the way, Arnold is going to have a company of Virginia riflemen led by a man named Daniel Morgan. Daniel Morgan was another veteran of the French and Indian War, and he's going to have a big future. That name's going to get called several times. Daniel Morgan. So these are riflemen. Okay, we talked about muskets last time that were smoothbore. These are These are muskets with long barrels and rifling inside of the barrel to put a spin on the bullet to make it more accurate. These guys are the equivalent of snipers. They would have said sharpshooters, but they also usually just called them riflemen. So the plan is for Arnold and his soldiers, including the riflemen led by Daniel Morgan, to sail to the mouth of the Kennebec River, and that's in modern-day Maine. Maine was not a separate colony or a state for quite some time. It would not become a state until 1820. It was part of Massachusetts. So their plan was to move up the Kennebec, and again, just think of Maine, and you're getting on this river, which is kind of in the southern part of Maine, and then you're going north toward Canada. Then they were going to transfer over land to the Chaudière River. And again, I may have mispronounced that. If so, I apologize. And then they were going to move up this river straight to Quebec. Remember, folks, that back in this day, travel by water was so much quicker in general than land travel that you didn't have any good roads. I mean, that was true in the Civil War, but especially in the Revolutionary War. Land travel was exceedingly slow. So they're going to go up one river, switch over to another river, and that river would take them straight to Quebec. Guy Carleton, the British commander in Canada, he would be forced to do one of two things. He would have to move troops from Montreal to Quebec because Quebec was very lightly defended, or he would have to leave Quebec undefended, neither of which was good. So think about this. If he leaves Quebec unattended, then Arnold would just march right in, grab it, and done. But if Carleton were to move troops from Montreal, which is a little bit to the south and the west, and move them up to Quebec, then Montreal would be weak and Richard Montgomery could grab it. So it seemed like a really good plan on paper, but we've seen that before, and great plans on paper often don't translate to be great plans on the field or on the ground. Okay, so here's Arnold and his troops. They're marching up north through Maine, what is now Maine, and they're going along this river. But along the way, everything starts to go wrong. They encounter heavy rain. They encounter an early frost and a hostile wilderness. And their maps were inaccurate. They had to carry their boats some of the time. Food ran low, shoes wore out, and one battalion simply quit and left. A lot of the boats were very poor quality and they leaked. So it was great suffering along this march. Very difficult. People got sick. People died. There are stories of men taking their moccasins or their shoes and boiling them and eating them. That doesn't sound like a very appetizing dinner, does it, Scott?
That sounds like people going to the Northwest Passage back in the 1850s and under total starvation conditions, which some of them would have been in. So this is pretty brutal.
This is not that far north, but pretty far north. And so you either eat your shoes or you die. And then, of course, if you eat your shoes, now you're walking barefoot through the snow. So things are getting worse and worse. But after 51 days, on the 8th of November, and remember, this is November in northern Maine / southern Canada, southeastern Canada, southeastern, around Quebec. So it's cold. It is really cold. One of Arnold's soldiers, but they reach it on November 8th. They reach Quebec, and one of Arnold's soldiers wrote in his diary, "It was the most prodigious march ever accomplished by man." That's a pretty bold claim, huh, Scott?
Yeah.
The most prodigious march ever accomplished by man. Well, maybe it'll tie for that. I'm not really sure, but there's been some other impressive marches. But in other words, that's how they felt anyway. Quebec only had 7 cannon and a few hundred second-rate guards. They didn't exactly have the crack British forces. These are guys that weren't good enough to go out in the regular army. They were given garrison duty. But Arnold only had about 650 men left, so he decided to rest his exhausted soldiers just outside of Quebec. While the Americans were resting, fortunately for the British, unfortunately for Arnold, several hundred British or Allied troops arrived to reinforce the city. Some of these were Canadian militia, some were regular British troops. So the city gets beefed up. The garrison does, that is. Finally, Arnold and his men crossed the St. Lawrence River, scaled the cliffs, just as had been done during the French and Indian War. They assembled at the Plains of Abraham, which is obviously you could tell it's a plain, it's a flat area, but it's outside of the city walls. Arnold demanded the city's surrender 3 times, but the British commander refused 3 times. I get a little chuckle out of that. Surrender. No. And then, well, okay, now surrender. No. All right, come on, please.
Hey everyone, Scott here. One more brief word from our sponsors. You have to feel pretty cozy when you're being under siege, but in your well-stocked fort in the winter in Canada while the people are outside freezing and shivering and starving.
Yeah, and so then Arnold decided to march around the city wall 7 times and blow trumpets, and then the walls came tumbling down.
Fun fact, in the First Crusade, that's what the Crusaders did when they arrived at Jerusalem. I don't know if they went around the wall 7 times, but they did go around once. So they thought, let's use some of that Old Testament magic. I don't believe, James, they did that this time. So sorry, I'm going to have to correct you. But
you're going to have to call me on that. Okay, maybe.
But you know what? There is a tradition of people doing this. It's not unprecedented.
Yeah. When I make a joke, listeners, you can also take a drink, and especially if Scott calls me on it, you can do 2. But,
yeah. Oh man, we're just filling up our Madiar glasses today.
So maybe it worked for Joshua, but it's not going to work for Arnold. He doesn't even try it. Arnold finally, he can't talk for some reason. He can't talk these British into surrendering. It's just like, come on! I said 3 times. It's like the people in the fort are saying, what part of no don't you understand? So Arnold finally decides, we need to try something else. He gave up the siege on November 18th. He moved 20 miles upstream toward Montreal, and he decided to wait for Montgomery to arrive and reinforce him. So he's thinking, well, let me just get more troops, and then maybe we'll try a full-scale assault. On November 11th, and this is a week prior to Arnold giving up the siege, Carleton had ordered Montreal abandoned. He went downriver toward Quebec. Along the way, he encountered a group of colonials who demanded his surrender. And this is kind of an exciting story here. This would make a good movie or a book. Maybe there is a novel. I mean, not a regular history book, although those are fun too. But Montgomery, I'm sorry. Carleton is the British commander, remember, and he's in Montreal. He leaves Montreal with a force. He almost gets captured, but he escapes in disguise. I always love it when they disguise themselves. And eventually he reaches Quebec, where he took command. So Arnold was hoping for reinforcements to arrive, but I don't think he had British reinforcements in mind. He wanted Montgomery. Montgomery is nowhere to be seen. So things don't get better for Arnold at the gates of Quebec. They get a little bit worse.
Do we know what Carleton disguised himself as?
I did not find that information. I don't know. It's probably just nothing real exciting.
A French fur trapper or
yeah, probably just something really like a common man. Probably just ditch the uniform and just dress like an ordinary civilian or something. That would be my guess.
It's not like he would do anything exotic, like a
bear costume.
Yeah, exactly.
Or a clown suit. No.
Yeah, I was trying to think. That's what I came to mind. Thought, did they have those in the 18th century? Probably not, but that's for another time, listeners. Well, yeah, I just want to add a couple of other things here that some people after the fact have assessed the problems with this campaign leading up to Montreal. There were some things that were out of control of preparation, not knowing weather conditions and some of those challenges, but 2 other challenges. First is that the route that Arnold took through Maine wilderness in southern Canada, James mentioned that their maps were incorrect. Part of the reason their maps were incorrect is that that area was highly speculative. There hadn't been many people who had traveled it. There'd only been a few bands of Indians and trappers. So there simply wasn't good, reliable information like there would be with reliable routes going through Ohio, for example. So essentially nothing was known about it. The other challenge is that the expedition was made up of mostly young men. The American High Command wanted active woodsmen to go on this journey, thinking they could fare better. Instead, what they got were inexperienced soldiers, and many of these rifleman companies were Scotch-Irish immigrants, and there are many Scotch-Irish immigrants to the colonies at this point. And to be sure, they were brave, they were hardy, they were rough and tumble, they could undergo hardship, but they didn't know anything about wilderness survival or about handling small boats going across rivers or being able to do portage, things like that. The other challenge or the problem is that in the First Continental Congress in October 1774, John Jay wrote a broadside. He addressed the people of Great Britain, and he insulted French jurisprudence and Roman Catholicism in very clear terms. The problem with this is that it alienated the Roman Catholic clergy in French Canada, and they started to lecture their flocks from the pulpit against the 13 Protestant colonies. So you're bringing Protestant Catholic divides, which have always been low-level boiling after the 30 Years' War 100 years earlier, after a very, very brutal, violent war on the European mainland. Things have simmered down since then, but it's kind of easy to stoke those flames. So alienating Catholics with the rhetoric in the First Continental Congress was something that made culturally French and linguistically French people in Canada not so happy to join the patriotic cause.
Yeah, that was not very smart on the part of the colonials. Let's just go ahead and insult their religion. Yeah, that's a really great way to win friends and influence people.
So what do you think, James? Should we talk about what happens at Quebec, or should we just leave people hanging on a cliffhanger?
I say we leave them hanging.
Exactly. You know, there's a lot of anxiety around the troops about what would happen. So, dear listener, we want to give you a small taste of what it would be like to not know what your fate is going to be by having to spend 5 or 10 seconds waiting to click over to the next podcast. So that's how we immerse you in the historical experience. All right, well, that's all for this episode. So we'll see you in the next one, where we look at the fight at Quebec and other things happening in the colonies. All right, well, that wraps up our exploration of the past for this episode. As always, I want to thank the Knowlton's Rangers, especially our spy masters: Tyler from Colorado, Josh Reddick, Baron Fraser, Chris from Maine, Carl from Norway, Moondoggy from Ohio, Rick Knowlton, Vic and Irene, Mike from New York, Michelle, and Marlene. I'll explain what that is in a second. If you like the show and want to help it grow, there are 4 easy ways for you to do it. 1, like and subscribe to the show on the podcast player of your choice. This helps spread the word about the show. 2, join our Facebook group. Here we can keep the discussion going about new episodes, and you can talk about what you like and didn't like. And you can find this group if you just search for History Unplugged on Facebook. 3, we have an online store with t-shirts, phone covers, and other accessories featuring awesomely bad history puns that were crowdsourced by you, the audience. And you can find that if you go to teespring.com/stores/history-unplugged. That's teespring.com/stores/history-unplugged. 4, and this is really the best way to dive deep with History Unplugged, and that's to become one of the Knowlton's Rangers. If you know your American history, you know the Knowlton's Rangers were an elite spy and reconnaissance group in the American Revolutionary War, but it's also the name of the membership program of History Unplugged. You can join at 3 levels. If you join at the level of Scout, you can hear all the episodes of History Unplugged completely ad-free and get early access to new episodes, at least a week early. If you join at the Intelligence Officer level, you get special bonus episodes, like a 10-part series on the World War II hero Audie Murphy, a multi-part series called Ottoman Lives about different people in the Ottoman Empire, and a series called Rendezvous with Death that looks at biographical profiles of Americans who went to fight in World War I before America entered the war. The last level is Spy Master, where you get all that stuff, but you also get 3 hardcover history books: Forging a President, How the Wild West Created Teddy Roosevelt, Race to the Top of the World, Richard Byrd and the First Flight to the North Pole, and The Last Fighter Pilot, the true story of the final combat mission of World War II. Another bonus is you can choose a history topic for me to focus on for an entire episode that can go up to an hour, and I'll answer whatever question you have for me, and you get a shout out at the end of each episode. If you want to learn how to become a member of the Knowlton's Rangers, go to patreon.com/unplugged. That's patreon.com/unplugged. All right, well, that is all for my spiel. Thanks for listening to the History Unplugged podcast, from ancient Greece to the Cold War and everything else in between. See you next time.